Welcome and thank you for choosing freeconferencecall.com. You're helping people around the world communicate for free. Please enter your access code followed by the pound or hash sign. If you are the host, press star now. Otherwise, please wait and you will be joined into the conference.
So Jamal, when you read over here. Just read it. That's what I like. What camera is that? That's the camera. When Jamar is gonna read, unmute.
You need to have that downloaded. You don't want people to hear him.
You gonna call in? If don't nobody call in, I'm gonna turn it off.
Why don't you just mute the phone? I don't understand why you have to.
I was wondering about that. If you mute it, they can't hear what's going on here, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's muted. See, I tried that and I wasn't sure whether or not it.
Or you just turn your volume all the way down and keep it unmuted. They can still hear you, you just can't hear them.
Even when I muted it still.
He said turn it all the way down.
Yeah, I'm saying just unmute it, and then just turn the volume down on the phone.
Few more minutes.
Just let us know when we're live. So what is it gonna do afterwards?
It's gonna do it first thing.
So it's gonna come to dad, he's gonna say blah, 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 and then she's gonna do it.
No, she just gonna say blah, 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 blah.
But there's not gonna be a camera on her. So she's just gonna talk.
Yeah.
Oh, you wanted to go one point? Okay.
At what point you wanna do that?
She's just gonna say, have to, like, you don't walk in right before them, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Just have to stop. Yeah, but I was not gonna have her go up to the podium and start talking, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, let it stand on it.
What time is it, homie? You gotta shout it out, so we know.
Is he up there when it's time to say it?
Yeah, she should probably already be up there.
So, good morning, church. I'm Jamar Burns, and I'd like to say happy Father's Day to all of the fathers in the church. And I have a card that I'm going to read.
So since she's gonna go to the
We are
podium.
now starting.
I come from my people. I come from
for you, Dad, on Father's Day and always, for every prayer you ever whispered for me, Dad, every blessing, every concern, every wish, and every hope. You have a very special place in my heart. Philippians chapter 1, verse 7. My prayer for you is that you know how loved you are always. Have a blessed day. Love your son, Cabral. Thank you.
I'm good. I'd like to welcome you to the Church of the Living God on this Father's Day 2020. My name is Pastor Robert L. Thomas, pastor of the Church of the Living God in the beautiful city of Sacramento, California. It's indeed a pleasure to be here on Father's Day 2020. Before we get started, I want to just tell you, in case you know someone who might be interested in joining us by live stream this morning, they can simply go to churchofthelivingGod.net. That is simply key in churchofthelivingGod.net. And you can actually be part of the service. We would appreciate it if you would leave a comment. Amen. We are going to take advantage of this opportunity, Father's Day 2020, to do something a little bit differently than what we normally do. We normally just celebrate our salute fathers, which is a great thing. Father's Day, a day being set aside to recognize and honor father. What a beautiful concept. Today, though, we are going to steal a little piece of the program, and we're going to salute grandfathers. Grandfathers. So we're going to, yes, it's been pointed out that a grandfather's a father, and that's true, but a grandfather is a little bit more of a heavyweight than a father. He is qualified to tell a father what to do. There are some men that feel can't nobody tell them anything, can't nobody tell them what to do. But I just stopped by to tell you that Grandpa can. And so today we're going to take a look at grandfathers and what grandfathers bring to society, what they bring to the table. We have a text I'd like to direct your attention to, coming from 2nd Chronicles, where we are going to read from chapter 33. 2nd Chronicles, chapter 33. And we're going to read it. It's going to be a little bit lengthy, but if you bear with me, we'll still be able to get this in, and this will just be a one sermon. It's not going to be a series, even though we could build a compelling argument that it should be, perhaps. Reading from 2 Chronicles chapter 33, beginning with verse 1, we have the story of a king of Judah by the name of Manasseh. Manasseh. We're going to use his story as our launching pad or as our foundation for this message this morning. Reading from 2 Chronicles chapter 33, beginning with verse 1, and we are going to read through verse 16. Verse 1 reads, Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. For those of you who might not know what's meant by reign, he was the king for 55 years. That's a long time. When we look at the typical span of a king in Jerusalem, it wouldn't be anywhere close to that. That's longer than David reigned, longer than the time frame that David was king. So here we got a man by the name of Manasseh, and the Bible tells us he was only 12 years old when he began to reign, when he became king, and he remained in that position for 55 years. Verse number 2 says, but did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, like unto the abomination of the heathens, whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. So what it said, even though he had a very long reign, it says here in verse 2, but he did that which was evil. He didn't do the right thing when he first became king. So we see this. It said, but he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, like unto the abominations, the sin. Whenever we see abomination, that means sinful behavior. He engaged in a lot of sinful behavior. That's what this is telling us. Verse 3 says, for he built again the high places which Hezekiah, his father, had broken down. And he reared up altars for Balaam and made groves and worshiped all the host of heaven and served them. So what we see, whenever we see Balaam, he worshiped a false god. He worshiped a god other than the God that we serve. So we see here that when we get a little bit about Manasseh, when we read a little bit about him here, we see that one of the things he did was he built altars to false gods, which was forbidden by the Ten Commandments. So he violated God's commandments by building these altars to false gods. He worshiped false gods. And then when we continue to read this, Verse 4, also he built altars in the house of the Lord. He actually went into the temple and he built altars. An altar was something that you build in worship of, where you burn sacrifices on altars. Well, not only did he do that in what the Bible said called high places, he actually went into the church and did it, or in the temple. And he built altars so he could sacrifice animals to Baal. And it says, also he built altars, I'm reading verse 4, in the house of the Lord, whereof the Lord had said, in Jerusalem shall my name be. But he brought in the name of others, and only the name of God was to be in the temple. But we saw here that Manasseh, he brought in other gods, the names of other gods. And verse 5 says, and he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. And 6 says, and he caused his children to pass through the fire in the valley of the Son, S-O-N, of Hinnom. Also he observed times and used enchantments and used witchcraft and dealt with a familiar spirit and with wizards. He wrought much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him, to provoke the Lord to anger. This is what Manasseh did. Verse 7 says, and he set a carved image, the owl which he had made in the house of God. He actually built a false image, a statue of some sort of a false god, and actually set it up in the church. And it says, of which God had said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen before all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name here. Only God's name was to go there, but he brought in another God. Verse 8 says, neither will I any more remove the foot of Israel. This is God talking, from out of the land which I have appointed for your fathers. Now we're going to drop down a little bit in the sake of time. Because what we have here, it says, verse 9, I'm going to read that. It says, so Manasseh made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to error. With his conduct, he made the other people in the nation of Judah to sin. He was the leader. Because of his conduct, he made others to sin. And then we're going to go to verse 11. We're not going to read every single verse here in the interest of time. Verse 11 says, wherefore the Lord brought up on them the captains of the hosts of the king of Assyria, which took Manasseh among the thorns and bound him with fetters and carried him to Babylon. So what we got here, this is very important. As a result of the sinful conduct or behavior of Manasseh, who was the king, God had him bound. He used the Babylonians he allowed the Babylonians to come in to Jerusalem and capture him. He captured Manasseh, bounded him, and took him back to Babylon because of his sin. And then verse 12 says, and when he was in affliction, when he was experiencing that pain of having been captured and bound, and they had stuck thorns in him and other objects, had tortured him down in Babylon, and he found himself in a state of affliction, he cried out to the Lord. But he didn't do that before. When we first started reading this, when we read from the very beginning, we saw that he flagrantly disobeyed and discounted God. And he did whatever he wanted to do. And he engaged in all type of wickedness. But when God sent the enemy up on him, and he was captured and taken out of Jerusalem into Babylon, and he found himself in a perpetual state of affliction, he cried out to the Lord. That's a good thing. At least he was smart enough, aware enough to know what kind of condition he was finally in. And in that state, he turned to the Lord. That's what we see here. It said 12. And when he was in affliction, he besought God. Sometimes you have to go down before you can come up. Sometimes this is the road to serving God. Sometimes we have to sink all the way to the bottom like Manasseh did. And we see here this man, Manasseh, this king, who was a grandfather. He was the grandfather of Josiah. But he started out disobeying God. He started out not considering God. He started out not honoring God. He started out, God was not important in his life. He walked the way he wanted to walk. And he did what pleased him. And one of his least concerns was pleasing the Lord. But then God brought him down. God allowed the king of Assyria to come in and actually took him off his throne and took him to Babylon and tortured him. And then we see him, it said in 12, and when he was in affliction, he besought the Lord his God and humbled himself. Before that, he walked proudly. His britches was too big for the Lord at first. But after a while, God got tired of his behavior. See, God will bear with us for a while. But there does come a time when we begin to walk in a way that is contrary to the way God wants us to walk. He'll get our attention, as he did Manasseh. And it says here, he humbled himself greatly before the God. He reached a turning point. Manasseh was a grandfather who reached a turning point in his life. I wish I had some help. I wish I had somebody. I said, we are studying about a man who started out one way. He started out walking under his own power. He started out not considering God. He started out doing all manner of wickedness, but he reached a turning point. There comes a time. There must come a time in your life where you reach a turning point where you say, the things I used to do, I don't do no more. The places I used to go, I don't go there anymore. The way I used to talk, I don't talk like that anymore. That's what Manasseh did. That's why he's a good role model. He's a good example of a grandfather. So now, after he reached the turning point, even though he had to go through some trials and tribulations, he was now worthy to be held up as somebody we could look up on and say, hey, see how Manasseh is doing. That's how you ought to behave. And verse 13 says, and he prayed unto God. He didn't know how to pray at first. He didn't pray until God brought him down. We don't see anything about Manasseh praying during the earlier part of his life. Certainly, if he prayed, it was not something he had a regular habit of praying. We need to have a regular habit of praying as children of God. We need to be known as people who pray, praying men and women. When they say, hey, what about Brother Jones here? Somebody ought to say, that's a praying man. What about Sister Smith here? Somebody ought to say, oh, Sister Smith, that's a praying woman. But we couldn't have said that about Manasseh during the first phase of his life. During the first phase of his life, he served Baal and other gods, even to the point where he built statues of them. But we see here when we get to verse 13, now he's learned how to pray. There's nothing like a praying, we could say a praying grandfather. Nothing like it. Because he's praying from experience. He knows what God will do, good and bad. He knows God. He knows that when one walks wickedly without the Lord, there's going to come a day of reckoning. When he tells his grandson that, or his granddaughter. Why? Because he has lived it. He has experienced it. I don't care what anybody says. I don't care how much a person has read or what kind of credentials he has. Experience can simply not be overlooked or diminished. Manasseh had experience. Manasseh could stand in the congregation and say, a day of judgment will come when you disobey God. And he wouldn't just be talking about what somebody told him. When a grandfather speaks, he's not talking about just what somebody hearsay, or something he read somewhere, or something he thinks might be a good idea. He is speaking from personal experience that it is a mistake to discount God in this life. That is an error. That we need to give God his. We need to give God some time. We need to give him service. We need to bow down to him. And so Manasseh became someone who had a testimony. What about a king who got a testimony, who could stand before the people and say, God doesn't like that? Well, we see this. It said, 13, and prayed. Manasseh prayed, and he was entreated of him, and God heard his supplication. Oh, praying, and God doesn't hear you. Oh, that doesn't do any good. That's a bad situation to be caught in. But it said that when Grandpa prayed, God heard his supplication. A lot of times, the father may not have had the experience with God that Grandpa had. He may not have cried out to the Lord the way Manasseh cried out to him, or the way David cried out to him. Dad may not have had that experience. Not taking anything away from Dad, but Dad may not have had the experience that Grandpa has had. Don't poo-poo Grandpa. That's a mistake. He is a walking library of knowledge and experience. Whether you like it or not, I won't acknowledge it or not, it's real. And so that's why we get this here. It says, God heard his prayers. Now, that's what you want there. That's like when you are churning that butter. Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. You can churn butter a long time, but you don't have nothing until you start seeing that butter come to the top. You can churn and churn, but you don't have nothing. But then finally, when you churn long enough, you'll begin to see that yellow, and you know you got something. Well, you don't have nothing unless God, you can pray 1,000 prayers. But if God didn't hear none of them, but he heard Manasseh's prayers because Manasseh had reached a turning point. And when he cried out to the Lord picked up the phone and he called. That's my boy on the other line. He became right with the Lord. We have to become right with the Lord. And so we see here we got a grandfather who, he started out wrong, but he became right. He got on the right track. See, it doesn't matter how long you've been walking wrong. Now, as long as you're on this side of the earth, you can get right with the Lord. I'm calling on grandpas to get right with the Lord today. Get right with the Lord, like this man did. He reached a turning point in his life. And it says here, God heard, verse 13 says, God heard his prayers, his supplications, and did what? He brought him back to the throne. That hardly ever happened. Well, this man, all that he had done, all the wickedness he had done, and then God unleashed his enemies up on him and allowed him to be captured and taken way to Babylon, which was hundreds of miles away. He was tortured, but him, Manasseh, being a wise man, or at some point he woke up and cried out to the Lord, and the Lord heard him and returned him to Jerusalem and set him back up on the throne. What if you used to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company and you got hooked on alcohol? You got addicted to drugs, and you went all the way down to the bottom where you found yourself homeless or you were sleeping in a flop house. If you cry out to the Lord, I ain't gonna get no help. If you cry out to the Lord the way Manasseh did, the Bible said, in his afflictions he cried out to the Lord. And we see here the Lord heard him and the Lord restored him to his throne. He didn't just bring him up, and just put him back in the nation of Judah. God could have done that. He could have said, okay, now that you've gotten right, now that you have repented, now that you've given up the false gods, I'm going to bring you back and I'm going to drop you off back in Israel and Judah. And you can fend for yourself from then on. No. God did better than that. God did better than that. It says here, after God heard his supplications, he brought him again to Jerusalem, not to just the city, but into his kingdom. He restored him. He returned him to his throne. But first he had to acknowledge that he needed the Lord, that he cried out in his affliction. Oh, and then I like the latter part of verse 13. It says, then Manasseh knew. We could say Manasseh knew beyond a shadow of a doubt. Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. You couldn't tell him. I don't care what anybody else came in there saying. So we need more Christians like that today who, no matter what anybody else is saying, one of the things that continually amazes me is how easily Christians can be misled. Somebody can come in and tell a Christian, no, you don't need to go to that old church over there. You don't need to go. You can come on and you can come go with us to the burial day, and Christians would do that. Somebody can come in and say, hey, you know what? There ain't really no God. That's make-believe. And we have Christians who will say, I hadn't looked at it that way. But you couldn't do that with Manasseh. You couldn't do that with Manasseh, with Grandpa, because Manasseh said this. It said, the latter part of verse 13 says, and we're reading from 33, the 33rd chapter of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, verse 12, verse 13, it said, Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. I don't care what you say. You could have 50 people could stand up and say there is no God. Manasseh would say you're wrong. He knew because of his experience, not because of what he had read. Oh, I wish I hadn't. Not because of what he had heard someone else say, but because of his experience. Folks, I'll say it again. We can go all the way around the mulberry bush, but there ain't nothing like having experience with the Lord. where you can say, I know what God will do because he did it for me. And I know what God will do. We can build God up as somebody who would never do anything to make it difficult for somebody. But that Manasseh would tell you that's not true. That God will bring about punishment for your wrongdoing. He became a true witness for the Lord. 14 says, now after this he built a wall without the city of David on the west side of Gihon in the valley, even to the entering in at the fish gate, and compassed about Opah and raised it up a very great height. In other words, he started building the city up for the Lord. What he used to build for Baal, he's now concerned about repairing and building up the walls of the city where it will be a blessing, a pleasant, a sweet aroma to the Lord. He's working for the Lord now. Come on. It said he raised up a very great height, and he put captains of war in all the fenced cities of Judah. He did it right. He built up the city to protect it from the enemies of Jerusalem. And then when we go to 15, and he took away the strange gods. Before he brought in strange gods. He worshiped strange gods. He built altars to strange gods. But we don't see him doing that now. In verse 15, it said, he took away the strange gods and the idols out of the house of the Lord. He cleaned up. In other words, when he woke up, he got up and he cleaned up. He didn't just wake up and say, you know what I did was wrong. He did something. He went and he tore down all that mess. He got rid of all those strange gods. He purged that stuff out of his life. That stuff that he used to do. He got rid of it. He said he took away the strange gods and the idols out of the house of the Lord, and all the altars that he had built in the mount of the house of the Lord and in Jerusalem, and cast them out of the city. He got rid of all that stuff. See, sometimes we hang on to some stuff from our previous way of living. That's a major problem we have. When we become converted, we got to do like Manasseh did. When he came to grips with, yes, God is real, he behaved like it from then on. When we get that kind of insight, or we have that type of revelation, then our walk should match what we now know. Or as one writer said, when the scales are lifted from a man's eyes, we don't expect him to keep stumbling up in places that he stumbled into before, or stumbled into situations that he stumbled into before when he had scales on his eyes. But once the scales were lifted from Manasseh's eyes, from Grandpa's eyes, Grandpa changed. So he went on, verse 16, and he repaired the altar of the Lord and sacrificed thereon to God. He didn't sacrifice to Baal anymore. He wouldn't be caught doing that. He repaired the altar in the house of the Lord and sacrificed upon that. And I like the latter part of verse 16. It says, and he commanded as king. Can you imagine that? He commanded the people of Judah to serve God and God only. He said there will be no other gods. Now, we're going to move on in the interest of time. I said, Manasseh, the grandfather of Josiah, started out not walking with the Lord. He did all manner of evil. He was an insult to the Lord. He was an abomination to the Lord. But he changed, and the last part of his life, he walked with the Lord. And the beautiful thing now is Manasseh had a son named Amon who became king. And then his grandson was Josiah, who became king after his dad, after Amon. Now, look at this. His son Amon became king and only lasted 2 years. So Manasseh, I told you at the beginning, he served 55 years. He had a long reign. But his son Amon was assassinated. We studied about it. He was assassinated after 2 years. Why? Because he was wicked. And Amon remembered the first part of Manasseh's life. See, he didn't know. He didn't know about the Bible. He was influenced by what his daddy did during the first part of his life when he walked wicked. And so that's how he walked. But along came years later Josiah, Amos' son, who he was too young, not even born, when Manasseh was doing all that wickedness. Josiah was either not born or he was too young. He didn't know about all that. When he thought of grandpa, he thought of all the days that grandpa walked with the Lord. He thought of a man, when he thought of grandpa, he thought of a man who tore down all of those altars that were built to worship Baal. He thought of a man that cleansed all of that mess out of the temple. So he became Josiah's role model and not his dad. See, that's why I want to talk a little bit about grandfathers sometime, because sometime the greatest influence on a child's life, it won't be the parent, it'll be the grandparent. I just read some material here about this very thing. Many kids in this day and age are being raised by grandparents. Not the parents, not taking anything away from mom or dad, but on a Sunday like today, many kids, if they go to church, they'll go with the grandparent. If they go. If the grandparents don't go by and pick them up, don't take them, they won't go. That pop, father, dad, he's not going to pick them up. He's not going to get up out of bed and take them. But grandpa will or grandma will. So that's why I want to pause here, that grandpa brings to the table something that is needed, and his influence is on the child. We see here in the case of Manasseh, he influenced Josiah, who became king when he was a little old boy. And he finished up all the work, that wickedness that his dad had put back in, that Amon, who was Josiah's dad, when he had put back in a lot of those altars and had done a lot of that ungodly stuff, when Josiah, remembering how his grandpa walked, he tore all that stuff back out. I wish. We're going to close in the interest of time. But when we start thinking about the grandson being influenced more, there was no competition between them. It was just that Manasseh, grandpa, had had a revelation. He had walked with the Lord, and he knew right from wrong. See, old man knew right from wrong. I remember one time I was driving, and I had some group home kids. We had a thing when they used to have a hometown buffet. I had taken some of them up there because they had done good. And to get there, I needed to make a U-turn. And the sign said, no U-turn. And one of the kids said, you can go ahead and make the turn anyway. I said, no, I can't do that. He said, well, my dad do that all the time. I said, yeah, but I know better. I'm older than your dad. I have gained some experience because somewhere in my life, way back, I made a U-turn and got a ticket when I wasn't supposed to. Or I know somebody, I saw somebody who did that. So I know better than to do that. There ain't no excuse for grandpa behaving the way Pop might behave, because he knows better. But anyway, when we look at Josiah, having been influenced in a very impactful way by Manasseh, his grandfather, when he became king, he brought about a major national religious reform. He cleansed the nation of any kind of religious worship that did not worship God. He brought that about. He tore down all those temples that had been built to other gods. And the Bible said he walked the way his grandfather had walked, and he walked the way David walked, we know about the heart that David had for the Lord. Well, the Bible said that when Josiah became king, he walked the way David walked. To be compared to David, when we look at a man who had the kind of love for the Lord that he had, well, because of his influence, because of the influence of his grandfather, he walked the way David walked. His heart was joined to the heart of the Lord. So his thirst was to please the Lord. So one of the things we see about Grandpa, why we want to stop and pause here a minute, we want to just take a little bit of time here in 2020, is because of the influence that a grandfather has on his offspring. We need to salute that. And we need to point back to Manasseh. I just read a study about grandparents and their involvement, a relationship to their grandkids. And this was done by two guys from Norway, two Norwegians. And they studied 5,000 families where there were grandparents. And what they found was in the early stages of grandparenting, when grandparents themselves are kind of young, in their 50s, 60s, it said in most cases, the grandmother did a lot more for the grandchildren. But it said as they got older and got around age 70, they noticed that it was the grandfather doing more for and with the children. So Grandpa wasn't somebody just sitting on the sideline. See, sometimes we want to put Grandpa on the sideline and say he's just a side dude. Really not a major factor. But the research didn't show that. It said that especially as the couple, the grandparents got older, as they moved deeper into old age, it said that Grandpa played a major role in helping, in nurturing, in supporting, and taking care of the grandkids. Going to the school when the parents couldn't get off work and somebody needed to go out to the school to pick the kid up, that it was actually Grandpa doing that. He was not just a side character. The study did not show that. It showed that he was there, and especially the older the grandparents became. Finally, when we look at Grandpa, we're talking about grandfathers, why we want to salute them. The Bible said this. The Bible said a man leaves an inheritance. It didn't say to his children. It said his children's children. I mean, he can leave an inheritance to his children. That's a good man too. But the Bible said a righteous man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. And it's not just money. It's some of the stuff we talked about. See, Josiah inherited the faith and the correct way of walking from his grandfather. He probably got some money too, but it wasn't just the money that we inherit. See, we inherit other things, and one of the things we inherit from Grandpa, or one of the things that a child will inherit from his grandparents, it will be spiritual, it will be faith. It's not always silver and gold, even though ain't nothing wrong with that. But it's not always those kind of things. Psalms 145, in an interest of time, we're not going to go there, but Psalm 145, it talks about how the Bible said from generation to generation to generation, that it's not, our influence is not to just be on our children, but it is to be on our children's children. That's why I quickly silence a person when he tries to suggest a grandparent has no right to discipline, correct, or say anything to a grandchild who is headed in the wrong direction. He's not a sideliner. He's not somebody sitting on the bench over here watching the show. He's in the show. And he does have a dog in that fight. Amen. And of course, grandfathers teach. Grand. When something is grand, it's not that. If you got a piano, and I buy you a grand piano, you had a piano, and then I bought you I said this was a grand piano. Wouldn't you expect it to be better? Wouldn't you expect more from it? So the advice the teaching that the grandfather give, it should be seasoned with time. It should be proven. It shouldn't be guessing. So we salute today grandfathers. And finally, the reason why we want to do that, we're all aware of what has happened with this pandemic. A lot of grandfathers have been removed from the earth. We could build a compelling argument that more grandfathers have died than any other group. And so I think it's timely that we salute them.
I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. He watches me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches. I know he watches. I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. He watches me. His eye is on the sparrow. Now I know he watches me. He watches me. He watches me. I know he